okay, I figured out it had something to do with energy. Obviously it was a weapon, and it's directed. They controlled it somehow, so they got energy to interfere somehow in a specific area. So it was directed energy, and they used it as a weapon. And then I had heard that term since then. I think some people assume the conventional, laser beams and all that, but what else do you call a weapon that involves energy in space interfering? And we need to call it something. And also, folks said, well, energy weapons don't exist. It is only in Buck Rogers movies and, science fiction. So on the first series that we put out, Morgan Reynolds worked with me on that. I chose the title as the Star Wars Beam Weapons because we've had the Star Wars program, Reagan's SDI program, going back, years. Scratch your head. What do you think they developed in there?
Sure.
They were energy weapons. Mm-hmm. And so, they're real.
Mm-hmm. They are absolutely real in that you can... I know for a fact that in the last 2 days the American Prisons Department has taken receipt of a microwave area denial weapon that the military in Iraq and Afghanistan said they had no tactical use for, so it's now being peddled on the municipal authorities that run the prisons. So there's no doubt that I agree with you that directed energy weapons is a massively generic term, but that they exist is irrefutable, isn't it?
Right, but 5 years ago, people argued about that, and that's why I chose that name, the Star Wars Beam Weapons, because people have heard of the Star Wars program, Reagan Star Wars program, and I wanted to make that connection. But you don't know exactly how the trolls are going to twist it. They'll twist whatever you put out there anyway, so why bother to worry about it?
Right. Well, that actually leads me nicely in what I was going to ask you about in that realm, because in my research for this show, I came across numerous references accusing you of claiming that this was some sort of ray gun from outer space kind of scenario, and yet I can't find anywhere where you actually say that. Can you expand on that so we can clear that up before we go any further?
I've never said it, and when I came out with this first line of evidence, which showed the bathtub survived, the seismic impact wasn't as great, the building turned to dust, there are these cylindrical holes, these cutouts in it, there's toasted cars. I had, those separate pages, like a whole page full of each, and presented it in Seattle, came back, and it was the 11th of November at Berkeley. Stephen Jones gave a talk where he talked about Judy Wood's ray beams from space and space beams.
Is that where it originated, this false
The first time I ever heard it.
Mm.
It was on that day.
Very
so that term, has been used by the detractors. I made the point recently on another broadcast that the terminology that's attached to Judy Wood's research, Dr. Judy's research, is derogatory, and basically what I would contend is that we have the physicist Stephen E. Jones, if we take him as an example, who's a specialism in what's called Muon-catalyzed cold fusion. I mean, this guy is not stupid, yet he can't tell the difference between a directed energy weapon term and the SDI program and a ray beam from space. Now, if Dr. Judy and myself were to go around and saying, well,
fairy dust.
We understand, exactly. We understand. Let's make it a bit more fair, though. If we understand that Stephen E. Jones says that the World Trade Center was destroyed with dynamite, we think that's ridiculous. I mean, we're both smart enough to tell the difference between the terms thermite and dynamite. We don't agree that it was thermite because it doesn't explain anything when you study it. It doesn't explain anything at all. But we're smart enough to actually tell the difference between the words thermite and dynamite, and we've never gone around and we've never described Stephen E. Jones's research as saying that he was describing the process of using dynamite, because we know the difference. So why is this person not taking the trouble to make the distinguish between directed energy weapons and ray beams from space? that right there is immediately a red flag when this is supposed to be a person who should be caring about details like that if he's interested in the truth. And so this is one of the processes by which you can recognise the people who are actually trying to lead people into some blind alley, and those who are actually just saying, no, just go and look at the evidence for yourself. You can form your own conclusion about what sort of person I am, but please go and look at the evidence as to what's actually being put on the table, and report it accurately. Don't misquote it. Don't change it. Just say exactly what's on the page. Now, I suppose I'd just better mention, as we didn't at the beginning, but some of the things we've already referenced, Dr. Judy's referenced with the cars and things. Now, they're all laid out on Dr. Judy's website, drjudywood.com /WTC, is it, Judy?
Yes.
And so that, as a process of actually finding out, that's like the Cliff Notes page, isn't it? I mean, maybe you want to just mention...
That's why I call it the Cliff Notes page. I started calling it the aha page because I gathered all my aha moments together and pictures that particularly meant something to me that I named, like the wax spot car. And I've got quite a few different categories down that page, and at the top there's an index you can click on and go to those categories where there's discrete things like the timing issue. And then the stuff didn't end up in the basement. Hollow basement sounds. You progress down the page, you got the toasted cars. And further on down you get the Hutchison effect and the seismograph, and the magnetometer data and the weather information.
So, for the sake of our viewers, a lot of the things we'll be referencing tonight will be referencing back to visual images, which, if you want to give us that website again for people to write down.
Okay, drjudywood.com, one word, but drjudywood.com /WTC.
Right. So if they can bring that up, or alternatively, I believe they can go on our site, northeasttruth.ning, and hopefully we'll have some still footage on there, up so you've got a visual aid, if you like. It may prove useful to follow the thread of the conversation if you've got some images in front of you. Yeah?
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is one of the problems in that when you get down to it, this is pretty difficult for people to take on board. And I found from talking to people, I've been to various conferences and things, UFO conferences and this conference and that conference, and I have a little booklet where I've, printed out some of Dr. Judy's pictures into like a summary form, and whilst I'm describing, what's going on, I have to show them the pictures, because if I don't, they just becomes, oh really, you're just making that up, So you do have to see the pictures, and if I may say that one of the key points for me, and in fact one of the key pieces of evidence that has to be explained, I think, is it on that WTC page you've got the 42, or is it the 41 list of phenomena, Judy, that need to be explained?
Yes. Yeah, you go, it's like one page down below, right below the first introductory pictures. It's section AA2.
Right. And the key one for me was really when Dr. Judy pointed out the steel was turning to dust, because when you just see those pictures, and basically to look at the key pictures, you could see about 70 columns of unsupported steel turning to dust. And when I heard Judy describe this, I can't remember whether it was in an email or on a podcast that she'd done it or whatever it was, but I thought, that is just unbelievable, because you can actually see this steel turning to dust. So when you think about that, you then have to realise, well, what can turn a steel to dust like that? Can't be a bomb. It can't be thermite. The only thing that I know that can turn steel to dust like that is a file. Somebody scrubbing it with the end of it, and the little grains coming off it, because it's essentially turning to dust. So in other words, what's causing that dustification process? That's, for me, the key question that I confront people with, and they always say, I don't know, you tell me. And people have, one person even said, "Oh, that's just a theory." No, it isn't. It isn't a theory that the steel turned to dust. You can actually see it happening, and we've got about 4 different videos of it. We've got 1 or 2 still image sequences. I can't remember which 1 or 2.
Yeah, if you go to that page that we mentioned, drjudywood.com/WTC, right below the top you see this section of shortcuts with a blue bar across the top. There's 3 columns. In the left column, D, dustification. Click on that blue dot to the left of the letter, and that'll take you right to it.
Right. And that leads us into there aren't just the dustification issues with especially metal objects of whatever composition, is there? There's some very interesting footage that I came across of aluminium bars that seem to they're broken open essentially, and they look like the inside of an aero bar. People in the UK will know what I'm talking about there. There's some very peculiar phenomenon occurred.
Oh, John Hutchison's.
Yeah, in relation to the Hutchison effect, yeah.
Well, that was one of the key things, because I'd already got in touch with Dr. Judy, as I was saying, about, I don't know, late 2006 or something, maybe. Yeah, it was probably around then. And right. I'd followed the research she was doing pretty closely throughout 2007, and then I think it was late 2007 when she'd previously had this entry on a web page saved somewhere about this Hutchison effect, and I was already familiar with the Hutchison effect because I'd seen it in a documentary. And I'll just try and describe what the Hutchison effect is, because it's basically an interference effect, to go back to the interferometry angle that Dr. Judy's got all the expertise in. And John Hutchison is basically an independent scientist, an experimental scientist. He's hasn't got a PhD or a degree or anything, but he's, over a number of years, starting in about 1979, he was trying to reproduce some of the experiments of Nikola Tesla, and he rebuilt some of the circuits, and over time he acquired quite a lot of equipment, signal generators, Tesla coils for doing high voltage electricity work. He built a new type of RF modulator, I think, to go with the Tesla coil. I'm not sure if I'm using quite the right terminology. He basically ended up, to cut a long story short, observing some unusual effects, in that he was able to make objects levitate. He was able to make lumps of metal turn to jelly and then re-solidify, half an hour later or 20 minutes later. He saw stainless steel rusting. He saw the radiation from the background count drop during his experiments. There's no explanation in physics that I know of for that, where the background radiation count should suddenly drop and then come back up when you switch your equipment off, unless, of course, you're going behind a lead door, which he wasn't. So he discovered all these unusual phenomena, and in the early days, in the early 80s, he couldn't reproduce these reliably. He'd set the equipment up, switch it on, and it was only about 10% of the time he was getting the effects of the levitation and this sort of thing. And I'd already become familiar with that from reading a book called the Electric UFO by Albert Budden, and there's a chapter in that book called The Poltergeist Machine, which describes John Hutchison's research. And then it was later in a documentary in 1999 by Nick Cook. It's called $1 Billion Secret, where John Hutchison is mentioned, and a short clip of film is shown of his levitation effects. And so I was already familiar with that. And then when Dr. Judy showed me these phenomena that she'd uncovered in the evidence, the forensic study.
That was the most fun day.
It was indeed. We sort of joke about this now. That,
Andrew, why is that car parked upside down?
That was it. This was it. When she showed me this picture of this car, and I'd never seen this before, I was going, oh my God, this is it. This was a slam dunk. Because we'd seen all the phenomena that John Hutchison had created. We'd seen the jellified metal, in other words, in the beams in the World Trade Center, which had been stored by, is it WJ that have got that steel? It is, isn't it?
I believe so.
Yeah, it's a company that's held some of the steel fragments. We'd seen this other famous picture that's meant to be a thermite evidence, and it's not. It's called is it the meteor or the meteorite? Is it? They call it.
Yeah.
Lump. that was all fused, fused metal, fused material, fused filing cabinet, that was all fused together, and this is exactly what John Hutchison has done. He's fused metal and wood. You know, there's no way you can get a lump of wood inside the solid